Reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity, this is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. Hop on in here, become a member of our little community. Come find me at Classroom Psych on Twitter, and get on in here, ask any questions you might have. I will do my very best to answer them this week and every week. We're going to take a confident declaration made by a public figure about gender diversity, and we're going to use it as a sort of springboard for wider discussion. We're going to think about what it means and maybe take it for the question that we think it might be and do our best to answer it. This week, Kier Starmer was asked a classic question, about gender diversity. Kier Starmer was asked what makes a woman and what constitutes a woman. Gotta love these questions asked with, in good faith. We're going to see what Kier Starmer had to say in response. Here's Kier Starmer.
Let me start by saying the blindingly obvious. For 99.9 something percent of women, it's all biological and it's very straightforward. And the Labour Party has fought for women's rights for a very, very long time, for equality of pay, equality of recognition, etc. And we will fight for women's rights going into the future. So that's, in a sense, very straightforward. But as you will all know, there are a small number of people who do not identify with the gender that they were born into. And it can be incredibly stressful. And there are young people who are going through real anguish, actually, in relation to this. And I'm not going to join those that just want to add to the abuse of that small group of people.
Kier Starmer there, making some really interesting points about basically biological determinism, right? A view of gender that's very popular and very common in Western society, and that, to be completely honest, Western society kind of advocated around the world, and in so doing sort of oppressed indigenous communities and indigenous cultural practices, and indeed sexual and gender diversity as part of those practices through colonialism. We're going to need to talk about that at some point in a future episode. But where we talk about Kier Starmer's specific answer to this question, over 99% of people, it's all about biology. But for this small group, it's something else. Is a challenging answer to that question. And of course, it's hard to answer that question. That's why people ask it, is because they get to watch politicians wrap themselves in knots trying to find an answer. And the reason why they find it hard to find an answer is because we don't have a shared language to describe gender in the main. When we talk about gender in parlance, we find that people, generally speaking, talk about it as a universal construct, a whole thing that people have. You are a single gender. It's not as if different components of gender, different bits of it, are broken off and described in different ways. And that lack of language creates a real problem. So before we go any further, let's generate a language that Kier Starmer lacked and see if we can't kind of understand what Kier was saying and see if we can't try to understand the model of gender that is very popular. It's very common that it reveals. So let's start by talking about biological configuration. Better, let's talk about bodily configuration. Let's keep the question of biology slightly to the side for a moment. Bodily configuration is how your body is configured in relation to gendered anatomy. Your primary and secondary sexual characteristics fall under that umbrella, as do your chromosomes, and it's the characteristic that is used at birth, or if not before, to assign you a gender almost exclusively, right? So the first words that you will hear when you are born are congratulations, it's a girl, or congratulations, it's a boy often. And doctors primarily look down to make that assignment. Now let's separate that out because, as doctors make that assignment, there's a sort of assumption that you're going to grow up as a complete boy or as a complete girl, that's how you're going to identify pretty typically, that's how you're going to express yourself, and a bunch of assumptions get made about your future life from that assignment. So let's break this up a little bit to make it make sense linguistically. Let's talk about gender identity as distinct from your physical, or at least your kind of your bodily configuration. Now, gender identity is, I'll admit, very difficult to define. And the reason is because it's so personal, and the research is kind of getting into understanding gender identity. But I will say that I found a really good definition about 10 years ago. I'm pretty sure it was Meinville who said it. I cannot find the quote now to check. Apologies. Hey, get in the comments. I'm doing a bit of a Brendan Lee Mulligan. Get in the comments if you realize that I'm wrong at any point, particularly around this quote, but at any point, and I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have. And of course, I'm always open to being wrong. I'm a scientist. That's what we do. We're wrong all the time. The only thing that's consistent within any given gender identity, such as man or woman, amongst others, is a deep-seated sense of identification with that concept. The term rings true. It holds meaning. Something inside of us says, yes, that's right. That feels like home. That's what I am. If I was to ask you what gender you are, you might turn your attention inward, but it's unlikely that you'd look down to find an answer, right? So it's interesting that when doctors make an assignment at birth, of course, a child is far too young to ask what they experience themselves to be, and so that assignment is made without their consent in any way. And that's kind of interesting. It's an interesting approach, and while for most people, for the vast majority, even as Kier says, if we're taking the kind of, we're going to take the census that was conducted in England and Wales. I'm pretty sure the Scotland part of this has been held back for a little bit, but the England and Wales census showed that around 0.5% of the population experiences themselves to be discretely transgender. So if we're just talking about the transgender population, it's about 0.5% of the population. It's probably a little bit of an underestimation that some of the earlier research talked about 0.6% of the population, maybe a little more. It sort of depends on how you define gender diversity and the transgender experience discretely. Transgender experiences are very diverse, but what unites them is a sort of dissonance between how somebody has been assigned and the gender with which they identify. Now, when we talk about the transgender experience, we can see that there is a meaningful difference between how somebody is configured in relation to gendered anatomy and how somebody identifies on the inside. That's right, that feels like home, that's what I am. So I think it is useful to consider these two things as separate to one another, even though for a lot of people they experience a greater level of congruence between those two things. And in terms of gender diverse communities, we haven't had a chance to even talk about like non-binary communities and gender fluid communities, often for whom that kind of binary distinction, that binary view of gender creates real problems because people identify completely outside of or between the two kind of constructs that we have. Now, gender expression is how somebody performs their gender to themselves and to the world around them. It's an invitation to how people can relate to us. Gender expression, often people gender express themselves to create congruence where there is otherwise incongruence, but that's not always the case. Lots of people's gender expression can fall completely outside of the norm, and that's a completely legitimate way of being in the world. But the expectation is what I want to talk about here. When children are assigned a gender at birth, there's an expectation. This is why we don't have this language in common parlance, because so strong is the expectation that a child will, if they're assigned male at birth, that they'll identify as typically as a boy and they'll express themselves in more masculine ways. That's a sort of assumption that we make. When a child is born, congratulations, it's a boy. We can paint the nursery. We can, the clothes and books around the child, the toys that they have access to. We still have boys' schools and girls' schools, the toilets and changing rooms they'll have access to, the fragrances they can wear, what they'll wear at their wedding, how they're greeted by other people, whether they're given this kind of peck on the cheek or a thorough handshake, whether they're talked over at meetings, and of course, their name and pronouns. All of those things get determined. There's an assumption about what they'll be like in the world, and how the world will relate to them is on the basis of that basic assignment, all completely made on the basis of their physical configuration and with no level of provisionality, right? No one is saying, congratulations, it's a boy, or congratulations, it's a girl, but at some point, you're going to have to ask them. A model of gender that Kier is basically talking about in this quote that for most people, gender is essentially biological, describes a sort of model of gender that is sexually dimorphic. There are two genders in the world, male and female, and there are a set of characteristics that define one as distinct from the other, and biological determinism. What makes you the complete gender that you are can be assigned at birth. We can determine it at birth because the biological forces that drive your primary sexual characteristics that the doctor's using to make that assignment also drive your identity and how you express yourself and how you'll be in the world. Now, that is an interesting model of gender, but the reason that it is problematic and the reason that Kier ends up fumbling the answer here is because it carries with it a set of assumptions, a set of expectations around how people will be in the world. And those assumptions and expectations privilege cisgender experiences, right? Because people assume there's going to be congruence here, people who experience congruence, and that is, as Kier says, the majority of people, to a greater or lesser extent, but experience some level of congruence here, tolerably, means that they can tolerate that assignment. For those people, they are advantaged in society. They're kind of privileged by this model of gender. Now, we've been doing a bunch of work. Dr. McGowan and us have been doing some fantastic work looking at the experience of gender diverse communities who have to come out in this society that carries those cis normative, like these assumptions and rules and expectations that privilege cisgender experiences, people with that kind of congruence between biological configuration and gender identity. Those gendered assumptions and expectations and norms are the very norms that trap gender diverse communities. I think Conchita Verse put it really well. She said on Graham Norton not that long ago, she said, she's a member of the gay community and her experience not dissimilar to like Graham's, she described. And she said she grew up in a small community and it wasn't the funnest thing in the world. And she changed herself in every way imaginable because she just wanted to be part of the game. Now, our work with Dr. McGowan highlights that that's very similar for transgender experiences too. And I think actually it's probably pretty similar for gender diverse experiences in the main. That all of us do our best as we're growing up to try to be part of the game. And the fundamental reason is because, as Baumeister and Leary hypothesized in 1995, belonging is a fundamental human need. We're all driven to try to belong. And norms are the currency of belonging. So when we have cis normativity as the mainstream means by which we consider gender, when we have this kind of deterministic view that, hello, you're a boy in the world, congratulations, you're a boy, or congratulations, it's a girl, but we don't make room in society for the possibility of incongruence, what we do is create a set of expectations that bind people, that people have to change themselves in fundamental ways to find belonging. Of course, the problem for those circumstances is that it isn't really a good sense of belonging, because one of the pillars of belonging is whether you will be appreciated, whether you will be accepted in the world as your authentic self. So when we change ourselves in fundamental ways to be part of the game, it's very difficult to find a real, genuine, authentic sense of belonging. And we're changing ourselves in fundamental ways to find it. Now, Conchita Verse says this really cool thing. She says she changed herself in every way just to be part of the game. And then she realized, well, I create the game. And that is the process that Dr. McGowan's work highlights for our gender diverse young people in schools in the UK today. And for the gender diverse community more broadly, in fact, that coming out, and this is amazingly, we got some other absolutely fantastic researchers in the group talking about coming out specifically. Coming out is a process of searching for belonging as one's authentic self. But the problem that we find is that the norms and expectations of cis-normative society, those are boundaries that people have to transgress just to be themselves in the world. And therein lies the rub, the real problem that Kier Starmer is touching upon when he fumbles the answer here. The problem is that when we have a society that says that cisgender experiences are the norm, when we have a society that says that for the most people, in fact, for everyone really, in most normal society, biology drives it all, that biology determines how you'll identify that the same thing that drives your primary and secondary sexual characteristics is the same thing that drives your identity. When we privilege those experiences, we create a set of norms and rules that gender diverse folk have to transgress just to live in the world. And we find that the challenges of gender diverse communities, when we talk about things like dysphoria, when we talk about mental health difficulties for the community, one of the reasons for those mental health difficulties is because it is just difficult to be yourself in a cis-normative world. When we have a world that you go into a GP surgery, you log in, and the first thing it says is, are you male or are you female? When you go to the restaurant and the only toilets available are male and female, when you have only male and female changing rooms, and when we have circumstances that say which changing room, which toilet, which button you press in that GP surgery is determined for you at birth, with a strong assumption that you will just conform to that assignment, we run into a huge problem of belonging for gender minority communities. But it isn't just gender minority communities that are bound by this set of assumptions. We're all bound by them. I don't know whether you've had the experience that I have. Like, I've transitioned in the world, right? I transitioned about 10 years ago. And so I've experienced the world. I'm privileged in that sense, in a bunch of ways, but privileged in the sense that now as a girl in the world, often people don't know that I'm trans unless I tell them. That's an extraordinary and completely unearned privilege, a fluke of biology that I get away with that. And I need to acknowledge that unearned privilege. But one thing that it does grant me is a view into how we treat each other on the basis of that assignment, on the basis of our assumptions in a cis-normative society. Before I transitioned, I blew a tire. This is a classic story. I blew a tire on the side of the road up in the north of Wiltshire, and the world saw me as a boy changing a tire. And turned out I blew both tires on one side of my car. I ran over like a dropped exhaust or something. And I was on the side of the road, like repairing one of my tires. I was, replacing one of my tires. I know what I'm doing. I replaced one of my tires. And of course, to onlookers, I don't doubt that people seeing that I had two flat tires and replacing one of them realized that I was, it was a fool's errand. There was no way that I could replace both tires because, as I soon discovered, you only carry one spare tire in the back of your car. And so I went to all the trouble of replacing one and still had to call for help. But nobody at any point stopped to help me. Nobody stopped because they saw a man changing a tire and they assumed I knew what I was talking about. The cis-normative expectations, those social rules and norms that guide human behavior, people looked to me as a man and assumed I knew what I was talking about. It happened in the mechanics as well. When I would go in and take my car and they'd describe, in detail what was wrong with it. And I had no idea what I was talking about, what they were talking about, but I'd nod and smile and be like, yes, of course, my friend, yes. I understand the details of this car's functioning and I appreciate what you're doing. But when I transitioned and I blew a tire in a car park, again in the south of Wiltshire, I blew a tire at a car park and I had so many people offer help. I had two women come up, the second of which offered to ask the male head teacher to come out and help me because she was like, literally explicitly said, well, he's a man, so he'll be fine. Like, he's a man, he'll know what to do. I was like, wow. And I was sitting on the boot of my car, unwinding my jack, ready to replace my tire in the competent way that I did. I blew one this time. I'd learned from last time I could replace this tire, no problem. And this gentleman came up to me and he looked at my flat tire and he looked at me unwinding my jack and he was like, do you realize you've got a flat tire? I was like, what? Like unwinding my jack. No, I had no idea, sir. Thank you so much. People saw me and I guess under there somewhere just didn't think that I had the level of competence they once thought I did. The only thing that was different was that I was a girl in the world, you know? And for sure, I take my car into the mechanics and they do little more than say, hey, your car. So cars should go forwards. I don't know if you're aware of this, but cars generally go forwards. The problem that your car has is that it is not going forwards. So we're going to fix it. We're going to charge you money. That's the level of explanation I get now. Your car doesn't go. That's the problem. It's a no-go problem, and we need your car to go. So we're going to make it go. I got to say that there's also far less obvious ways that we do this. So I the way that I'm greeted in the world, completely different. I had one of my friends, one of my closest friends, when I transitioned, he deliberately started kissing me on the cheek when he greeted me, I think to kind of, in a sort of affirmative way. It was one of the beautiful moments of my life when he started doing that. Not because I was attracted to him. I need you to bear that in mind. I just like the idea that he treated me as a girl. Wonderful stuff. Quick peck on the cheek, I'll take it anytime, frankly. And more than that, I had another friend of mine who, post-transition, he would grab me by the hand and be like, all right, lad, and he'd slap me on the shoulder like, how are you doing, mate? How's it going? In this sort of very non-affirming way. And for sure, I appreciate what he was doing and the model of gender he was reinforcing, trying to pull me back into that kind of cis-normative expectations of society that I was just transgressing by being. So I sort of get it, but still not ideal, right? It's a problematic set of assumptions and norms that he was trying to reinforce. I've also been asked by a dear friend, to go to his sister's wedding as a boy when I was mid-transition. And again, you've never seen someone so sad to be at a wedding when I actually did go as a boy. Though I was manning up as best I could for the wedding. Again, just trying to hem in, trying to get people to conform to cis-normative expectations. Now, again, the more insidious ways go even a little bit deeper than that. Before I transitioned, I had no problem going into rooms and being listened to. I would literally walk into rooms as an assistant psychologist and make bold declarations because, of course, people listen to me. And if I didn't know what I was talking about, then surely people wouldn't listen to me, right? So it gave me a sort of personal arrogance almost as I started to get really confident in the world. And then I transitioned. And for sure, I remember discreetly the moment I lost that kind of privilege that I had experienced before. Again, completely unearned, and I did not appreciate it for a moment. But I walked into that room as a woman in the world, and I was talking at this kind of teacher consultation, and this gentleman teacher across the table was listening away, and I was just talking through the most important kind of bit of what I had to say, right? I thought this was a cool interpretation, a cool thing that I wanted to say, applying great psychology. And I started speaking, and in the information carrying words of the most important sentence that I was saying, this gentleman just started talking. And I was like, what is happening right now? Wait a second, what is going on? Wait. He just started speaking. And I noticed really quickly two things. One, it was not counter-normative for him to do so. Everyone in the room just turned and started listening to him. And I was like, right, okay. And two, it would have been counter-normative for me to interrupt him. Because in the moment I was like, I just want to say shut up. Shut up, dude. Shut up. But I realized that if I did that, I would be transgressing a norm. I would be seen as what? Aggressive or at the very least difficult, right? He hadn't been seen difficult for just cutting me off, but I would be very difficult to cut him off. And I suddenly realized the privilege that I had lost. But not only that, this kind of unspoken rules of cis-normativity that communicate a sort of expectation about what women are like in the world and what men are like in the world, and the boundaries that we all have to transgress just to be ourselves in the world. I was just trying to be a professional person, a professional woman. And the boundaries of cis-normative culture created a boundary that I needed to transgress just to be an expert in the room. I wonder if you yourself have had similar experiences. I've spoken to, fathers who have been in parents' evenings and had teachers just completely speak over them to their wives because they just don't assume that fathers are going to be responsible for child rearing or as interested perhaps in what was happening for their child. As sort of excluding as that might be, again, fathers having to challenge the cisnormative expectations of environments. And, I've had female doctors who've spoken to me about conducting complete physical workups on patients, heading to invite the patient to leave, and the patient just sitting and saying, actually, I'm just going to wait for the doctor. And so the female doctor looks at them skeptically and says, who do you think I am? And patients thinking that they're just extremely well-trained medical secretaries. And this is, again, all the transgression of these gendered norms and rules. You may well have had some experiences of your own. Please get in touch, get onto @ClassroomPsych on Twitter and let me know what your expectations that you have transgressed have been. What are the expectations of cisnormative society, these gendered rules and norms that are ties that bind us all? And then you might have just a little glimmer of a sense of what it's like to be a gender diverse person in the world who have to transgress basically all of the gendered norms and expectations of cisnormative society. So this is the task that we have in front of us. When we have Kier Starmer saying 99% of women, it's all biology, he's reinforcing a model of gender that is biologically deterministic and which create and reinforce those gendered norms and assumptions that suggest that we can assign children a gender at birth with no level of provisionality, and that suggests that there are a set of expectations that follow that assignment that gender diverse folk and maybe to some extent all of us need to transgress to live authentically in the world. Now, I'm going to take this one step further. Professor Kirsten Sandberg, who was the acting Supreme Court Justice for Norway and now is an elected member of the UNCRC, which is the UN Committee for the Rights of the Child, wrote in 2015 about the treatment of transgender children and young people, and highlight that children and young people have a right to non-discrimination, to identity, and they have a right to be heard in proceedings that affect them. And this becomes really relevant when we talk about the work of Professor Carrie Pichter from Nottingham, who wrote this. When we she said, basing a gender label on the child's bodily form is still only really a best guess attribution, as we do not know at this point for which children that will turn out to be inappropriate. And she says a major implication of the requirement to respect a child's identity is that for all children, attribution at birth should have some level of provisionality. Maybe, just maybe, we could create a society where at birth, doctors make an assignment. They say, congratulations, it's a boy, or congratulations, it's a girl. But at some point, maybe you're going to have to ask them. Thanks so very much for joining me. I'm your host, Cora. This is Classroom Psychology, and maybe together we can create a society where everyone can find a place to belong. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.